and welcome to the latest episode of Close Quarter. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jim Proferes, Global Executive Underwriting Officer of Professional Liability at Markel, who will be talking with me on the topic of the moment, ESG, but specifically how it impacts corporates and other industries and where professional liability comes into it. So Jim, welcome.
It's a pleasure to speak with you today, Sophie. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. So just to kick off with, what emerging risks are impacting companies and their boards of directors as the societal emphasis on ESG, of course, continues to grow?
Well, it's remarkable to me that ESG in a simple acronym is such a complex topic. Today, corporations are working very hard to define for themselves how they're going to respond to each part of ESG. To briefly go over the component parts, when I think about ESG, climate change is clearly the most high-profile topic. Climate change this week, with the global community getting together, putting themselves in a position to discuss how to curb climate change, was a really important inflection point. When I think about corporations and boards of directors, those directors are focused on ensuring that the corporation is making proper disclosures and evolving their business to be in a position for a future that is carbon neutral. I know many companies are looking out to 2050, but this is happening right now, and corporations are adjusting in very significant ways. So climate change and the environmental piece of ESG captures a lot of attention, but also the societal part of ESG is certainly a big exposure for professional liability underwriters. Exposures such as the significant move of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, how companies are positioning themselves with regard to their employees, topics such as pay equity, topics such as diverse workforces. Looking at a corporation in the last 10 years, there have been significant changes that have occurred in the employment community. The hashtag #MeToo movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. Companies are advancing very rapidly to put themselves in a position to be preferred employers, employers that have a diverse employee base, that pay fairly, that there's equity amongst positions by individual cultures, minorities, women, men. There's a significant leveling process going on right now. And finally, on the governance front, a lot can be said about corporations. Boards have to be focused on making sure that within a corporation, there's a duty of loyalty and a duty of care in constructing the company's internal controls, and that those internal controls are monitored to prevent risks, such as today, the ever-present risk of cyber events, that a company is protecting the data of individuals and customers and clients. Equally so, and it's not a new topic, that a corporation is acting properly in their way of doing business so that they do training to ensure that individuals aren't undertaking improper business practices, such as paying bribes to government officials. So areas of risk such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act, are real underwriting focal points. So ESG, a simple acronym, but quite a bit to unpack.
Jim, thank you so much for such a comprehensive opening there. So moving on to the second question that we have, which industries would you say are shifting resources to new ESG-focused products and business lines?
Most notable are auto manufacturers, companies that are in the fossil fuel industry, particularly the oil industry, companies that are carbon intensive, such as utilities, are industries that are making very significant shifts in their adjustment of capital budgeting and investment. We're living in a remarkable time where technology is moving very fast. It's extraordinary to think that 10, 15 years from now, we may be in a society where the majority of new car purchases would be electric vehicles, where the majority of energy is produced by solar, wind, hydro, and that we're at a time where investment is at a level that you're going to see new technologies evolve beyond those that I just mentioned. Battery power, find ourselves with long-term storage of solar energy. So when the sun goes down or the wind stops blowing, we'll still, as a society, have that type of energy source and consistent source.
Great, thank you very much. And then sort of an extension of that, of course, what do corporate risk managers and of course underwriters need to be aware of?
Well, corporate risk managers are always deeply involved in understanding their organization and looking across their organization to manage risk. ESG brings a new level of risk. I hone in on risk managers are going to be focused on how their company is evolving. They may get into new technologies. They may find, very likely will find, that the corporation is making much more in the way of disclosures about their carbon footprint, what they're disclosing in their financial statements, how they're managing their relationships with regulators, non-governmental organizations, how they're managing their relationships with customers and suppliers. Risk managers are going to have to be very in tune with all those new disclosures. And ultimately, they're going to be looking to their insurance providers to solve new risks that come up or be certain that their existing coverage covers these new dimensions of risk and those disclosures that are being made.
Okay, thank you very much. So as major industries continue to shift resources to ESG-focused products, which we've sort of touched on already, how does this change your view and how you view them as clients as you seek to include your own ESG principles into your own underwriting decisions?
It's a complex time always to be a professional liability underwriter, whether it's errors and omissions, directors and officers liability, employment practices liability, and the list goes on. But when thinking about ESG and a number of points that I've mentioned, there are new threads of underwriting that are going to have to be pulled together in the underwriting process, as well as how the underwriter will price risk that may be different than they knew a year or two ago with an existing client. So when thinking about the underwriting community for professional coverages, new question sets will be developed. When speaking with customers, the conversation around ESG may start as simply as, help us understand your plan. Where are you with the planning process? What milestones have you disclosed to regulators, to investors, to your employees? If it's something such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, have you made adequate progress? If you haven't, how is your board, how are executive leaders managing that process? So if you're an underwriter of EPL, you're going to be zeroing in on initiatives such as that. If you're an underwriter of E&O, you'll be looking at law firms or accounting firms that have created practices to seize business opportunities around ESG and what risks come from that.
Thank you. So during the interview, you've cited a lot of industries out there that are obviously doing, a great job at embracing ESG principles. But of course, there are some that need to do more, when it comes to their product offerings. How can insurers sort of help encourage this, and particularly with the transition process?
It's a terrific question, and so many different industries are trying to find a path forward to position themselves to be in a good standing with regulators, and those rules are going to change. So certain industries are going to have to move faster and more dramatically. At the same time, when we think about our relationship with clients, there are certain dimensions of our underwriting that will help risk managers and companies in certain industries move the process along. Professional liability may be less impactful than casualty or property, where there are strikingly apparent needs for companies in certain industries to move faster. But within professional liability, if you're an E&O underwriter and you're looking at a consulting firm that's focused on architects and engineers, that type of exposure, A&E companies are going to have to evolve pretty rapidly relative to the risks of climate change, flood, other perils that are natural perils. So it really permeates all industries. And within those industry subsectors, some are going to move faster than others. And the insurers have a place in bringing that along.
Great, thank you very much. And finally, Jim, looking forward into 2022, what emerging developments do you see on the horizon, sort of against the backdrop of which you've been sort of painting in this interview?
Well, as a professional liability underwriter, we're always attempting to look around corners and see what emerging risks are going to be there for us tomorrow. When I think about ESG and more broadly professional liability impactful events, what I do believe the industry will start to take a keener focus on is the financial services industry, which is going to be integral in funding a number of dimensions of ESG changes, particularly on the climate change. Trillions of dollars of capital are going to be invested in new technologies and transitions. When thinking about financial institutions, today, they're often on both sides of the equation, so to speak. Financial institutions, particularly banks, insurance companies, may have longstanding relationships with industries that may not be viewed as the most carbon friendly. Yet, there's opportunities to help those companies transition, and that will be very critical for insurers, banks, other investment firms. And then on the other side, there will be new industries that grow rapidly that present terrific opportunities. So underwriters of financial institutions, whether D&O, errors and omissions coverage, will be in a position to look at both sides of how financial institutions are going to be acting. I'll end with this point that has probably been overlooked by the underwriting community. Over the last couple of years, hundreds of billions of dollars have flown into ESG-centric mutual funds, investment funds, exchange-traded funds, sustainable bonds. And within those investments, and again, hundreds of billions of dollars have migrated, there is going to be a point in time where there is greater regulatory attention on what those returns are, what disclosures are being made to investors, how the financial institution positioned itself in selling those funds to individual investors. And we certainly know that large institutional investors are focused on moving some of their portfolio to ESG-centric funds. So it'll be intriguing to see how regulators and how financial institutions interact over the next couple of years. The concern would be if disclosures are not full and complete, or if there are questions about the returns that are being achieved or the branding of the funds relative to a large cap growth fund in which you have many of the same companies invested in, but they're at a significantly lower cost. So that's one area that I would suggest probably will capture a lot more attention of professional liability underwriters.
Jim, thank you very much. I mean, with 2022 just around the corner, it'll be interesting to see sort of what materializes. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your time and your interesting insights on this topic.
It's been my pleasure, Sophie.